I didn't say a word when my son threw my suitcase into the trash bin. The sound it made, plastic hitting metal, echoed down the quiet street. Inside that suitcase were 40 years of my life. Photos, letters, my late wife's wedding ring. And my son just stood there, watching it all sink beneath a pile of garbage bags. "Dad," he said coldly, "you can't live here anymore." Behind him, his wife crossed her arms and looked at me like I was something she'd just scraped off her shoe. "Take your things and go," she added. But the strange part wasn't the humiliation. It wasn't even the betrayal. The strange part was this. I didn't try to stop them, because they had forgotten one very small detail. And that mistake was going to change everything. But before I explain that, you're probably wondering how a father ends up standing on the curb while his own son throws his life into the trash. To understand that, we have to go back a little. My name is Harold. I'm 72 years old. I worked 38 years as a mechanic. Not glamorous work, but honest work. Grease under the fingernails. Long hours. Cold winters in an unheated garage. But every dollar I earned had a purpose. My family, my wife, Margaret, and our only son, Daniel. Margaret used to say something that always stuck with me. "Harold," she'd smile, "you'd give away your last dollar if it meant Daniel could have a better life." And she wasn't wrong. When Daniel was 10, he wanted a bicycle, a red one with chrome handlebars. I worked 2 extra weeks of overtime to buy it. When he was 17 and wanted to go to college, I sold my fishing boat. When he got married at 27, I gave him something even bigger. The house. Not just any house. The house Margaret and I built together. Every wall had our fingerprints on it. Every floorboard had a story. But Daniel had just gotten married to a woman named Vanessa, and they needed somewhere to start their life. So I told him something that shocked him. "Move in," I said. "This house is big enough for all of us." At first, everything seemed fine. But looking back now, I think the problem started the day Vanessa moved in, because she never looked at me like family. She looked at me like a problem that needed to be removed. I noticed it in small ways. At dinner, she'd say things like, "Daniel, maybe we should redecorate." Or, "This furniture is very old-fashioned," which was funny because that furniture belonged to Margaret. But I kept my mouth shut because Daniel seemed happy. And after Margaret passed away 3 years ago, his happiness was the only thing that mattered to me. Still, little things began to change. Vanessa slowly took control of the house. First the living room, then the kitchen, then the garage. One afternoon, I walked into the kitchen and couldn't find my coffee mug, the one Margaret had bought me 30 years earlier. I asked Vanessa about it. "Oh, that?" she said casually. "I threw it away." I remember staring at her. "You threw it away?" She shrugged. It looked old. That was the first moment I felt something shift inside this house. But I still told myself something important. She's young. She doesn't understand. But the tension didn't stop there. In fact, it got worse. One evening during dinner, Vanessa suddenly said something that caught me off guard. "You know," she said, looking directly at me, "most people your age live in retirement communities." Daniel shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "What are you saying?" I asked. She smiled politely. "I'm just saying this house could use more space." More space. Those 2 words hung in the air like smoke. Daniel quickly changed the subject, but I couldn't forget them, because deep down, I knew exactly what she meant. And unfortunately, I was right. Over the next few months, things began disappearing. First my books, then my tools, then entire boxes from the basement. Whenever I asked about them, Vanessa always had the same answer. "Oh, I thought you didn't need those anymore." One day I opened the garage and found my old workbench gone. That bench had been with me for 25 years. I asked Daniel about it. He rubbed the back of his neck. "Vanessa sold it online," he said. I felt a tight knot in my chest. She sold it. Dad, it was just taking up space. Just taking up space. That phrase again. And something about it didn't sit right with me. But what happened 2 weeks later? That's when everything truly changed. Because that was the night I accidentally overheard something that made my stomach drop. Something that made me realize this wasn't about space. It was about getting rid of me completely. And when I heard their real plan, even I was shocked. Segment 2 almost equals 1,000 words. Betrayal escalation secret plan. I wasn't trying to eavesdrop that night. At 72, you don't sneak around the house like a spy. You just move slowly, and sometimes people forget you're there. That evening I had gone to the kitchen for a glass of water. The hallway light was off, but the living room was glowing softly from the lamp Vanessa liked to leave on. And that's when I heard her voice. Low, sharp, annoyed. Daniel, we can't keep doing this. I stopped walking. Something about the tone made my chest tighten. Daniel sighed. I know. No, you don't know. Vanessa snapped quietly. He's still here. Still here. The way she said it, like I was a stain on the carpet. Daniel lowered his voice. What do you want me to do? He's my father. Vanessa laughed under her breath. Well, then maybe it's time he stops living like your roommate. I stood frozen in the hallway. The glass in my hand suddenly felt very heavy. Daniel spoke again, hesitantly. He doesn't have anywhere else to go. Vanessa didn't even pause. That's not our problem. My heart gave a slow, painful thump. Not our problem. Then she said something that made my stomach twist. You promised when we got married that this house would be ours. Daniel hesitated. It will be? When? She demanded. Silence filled the room. Then she said the words that changed everything. Sell it. I nearly dropped the glass. Daniel sounded shocked. Sell the house? Vanessa, my dad lives here. For now, she replied calmly. And that was the moment I realized this conversation wasn't hypothetical. They had already been thinking about this for a long time. Daniel spoke again. He'd never agreed to that. Vanessa's voice softened in a way that made my skin crawl. He doesn't have to. There was a pause. Then Daniel asked quietly, What do you mean? Vanessa leaned closer. I could hear the faint creak of the couch. Think about it, she whispered. You already handled most of the paperwork. Paperwork? My grip tightened on the glass. Daniel sounded nervous. Vanessa, we can't just... Yes, we can. Her voice was calm. Too calm. All we need is the right documents. My stomach dropped. Documents? Daniel whispered something I could barely hear. That's illegal. Vanessa scoffed. No one's going to check. Then she added something that made the blood drain from my face. He's old, Daniel. People expect old people move out eventually. Old, like I was a broken chair. Disposable. Daniel didn't respond right away. When he finally spoke, his voice sounded uncertain. But he built this place. Vanessa didn't care. Exactly, she said. It's worth a lot. Worth a lot. Those 3 words hung in the air, and suddenly everything made sense. The missing tools, the disappearing boxes, the constant talk about space. They weren't trying to redecorate. They were preparing the house to sell it. And me? I was the last obstacle. But what Vanessa said next, that's when I understood how far she was willing to go. She leaned closer and whispered something that made my heart pound. We'll tell him it's time for assisted living. Daniel sounded uncomfortable. He's not sick. Vanessa shrugged. He's 72. That's not the same thing. Daniel, she said softly, do you want a future with me, or do you want to keep living with your father forever? The room went silent, and I realized something that hurt more than anything Vanessa had said. Daniel didn't defend me. Not really. Instead, he asked a question. What happens if he refuses? Vanessa's answer came instantly. Then we make it uncomfortable. My throat tightened. Uncomfortable. She continued. People his age hate conflict. He'll leave eventually. Daniel muttered something, but Vanessa wasn't finished. And if he still won't go, she added quietly, we'll give him a deadline. A deadline, like I was a tenant, not his father. The silence that followed felt endless. Then Daniel sighed. Maybe we should think about it. Vanessa sounded satisfied. That's all I'm asking. But she wasn't. Not really. And deep down, I knew it. I slowly stepped backward into the hallway. The glass of water in my hand was still untouched. My chest felt heavy. not just from what I heard, but from what Daniel didn't say. Because the son I raised, the boy whose bike I bought, whose college I paid for, he had just listened to a plan to push me out of my own home. And he didn't stop it. I went back to my room that night without making a sound. Sleep never came. Instead, I stared at the ceiling for hours, thinking, remembering, wondering where I had gone wrong. But sometime around 3 in the morning, a strange feeling replaced the sadness. Something quieter, something calmer. Because while Vanessa believed I was just an old man, she had made one very important mistake. She assumed I didn't understand what was happening, and that assumption was going to cost them more than they realized. But the real trouble started 2 weeks later, because that's when Vanessa decided to stop being patient. And what she did that afternoon, well, that's when the humiliation truly began. And when my own son finally chose a side. Segment 3 almost equals 1,000 words. Discovery, power shift. The humiliation started on a Tuesday afternoon. I remember the day clearly because it was raining. The kind of slow gray rain that makes the whole world feel quiet. I had just come back from the grocery store with 2 small bags when I noticed something strange. The front door lock had been changed. At first, I thought I was mistaken. My key slid into the lock, but it wouldn't turn. I tried again. Nothing. That's when the front door suddenly opened. Vanessa stood there. She didn't look surprised to see me. In fact, she looked prepared. "Oh," she said flatly, "you're back." I stared at the door. Why doesn't my key work? She leaned against the door frame, like this was the most normal thing in the world. We changed the locks. The rain continued falling behind me. Cold water slowly soaked through my jacket. "You changed the locks?" I repeated. Vanessa nodded. "Daniel and I talked about it." My chest tightened. "Where's Daniel?" "Inside." Something about her smile made my stomach twist. I stepped forward. "I live here." Vanessa didn't move. Not anymore. The words landed like a punch to the chest. I stared at her. "What are you talking about?" She shrugged casually. "You can't stay here forever." My heart started beating faster. "I built this house." She tilted her head. "That's your opinion." "My opinion." I felt my hands trembling. "Get Daniel." Vanessa sighed dramatically and stepped aside. "Fine." I walked inside slowly. The house felt different, quieter, colder, and then I noticed something that made my stomach drop. My chair was gone. The old brown recliner I had sat in every evening for 10 years, gone. My bookshelves empty. My photos missing from the wall. I turned toward the hallway. "Daniel?" He walked out of the kitchen a moment later. But he didn't look at me the way he used to. His eyes were distant, avoiding mine. "Dad," he said quietly, "what's going on?" I asked. Daniel rubbed the back of his neck. "We need to talk." Those 4 words, they always mean something bad. Vanessa crossed her arms beside him. "This conversation is overdue," she said. Daniel took a deep breath. "Dad, we think it's time for you to move out." The room suddenly felt very small. "Move out," I repeated slowly. "You're 72, Vanessa added, as if that explained everything. Daniel continued. "There are nice assisted living places nearby." Assisted living. I stared at him. "I'm not sick." "We know," he said quickly, "but it might be better for everyone." Better for everyone. I looked around the room again. The missing photos. The empty shelves. "You packed my things?" Vanessa pointed toward the front door. "They're outside." Outside. I walked slowly back to the porch. And there they were. 3 trash bags. A suitcase. 2 cardboard boxes. Sitting beside the garbage bin. The rain had soaked everything. Inside one of the boxes, I could see photo albums. Margaret's old sweater. My hands trembled as I picked up the suitcase. That's when Daniel came outside. "Dad, don't make this harder than it has to be." "Harder?" I looked at him carefully. "You planned this." Daniel looked away. Vanessa answered instead. "We gave you plenty of time. Plenty of time. To leave my own house." Neighbors across the street were watching now. Curtains shifting. Curious faces. The humiliation burned in my chest. Then Daniel said something that I will never forget. You can stay at a motel for a few days while we figure things out. A motel. After 40 years of building a life in this house. And that's when my suitcase hit the trash bin, thrown there by my own son. Take your things and go, Vanessa said. But something strange happened in that moment. Instead of shouting, instead of begging, I suddenly felt very calm. Because while Vanessa believed she had already won, I realized something she had completely overlooked. Something important. Something very small, but very powerful. I slowly bent down and picked up the suitcase. Rain dripped from the edge of the lid. Daniel shifted uncomfortably. Dad, please just go for now. I looked at him, really looked at him, the boy I had raised, the man standing in front of me, and then I asked one quiet question. Daniel, who told you that you could throw me out? He frowned. What do you mean? Vanessa rolled her eyes. Oh, please. But I wasn't looking at her. I was looking at my son. Who told you the house belongs to you? Daniel blinked. What? Vanessa laughed. Are you serious right now? But I continued calmly. Daniel, I said softly, did you ever actually check the paperwork? The silence that followed was sudden. Heavy. Daniel looked confused. What paperwork? Vanessa's smile faded slightly. I watched both of them carefully, because in that moment, I realized something very important. They had assumed something. They had believed something, but they had never verified it. And that tiny mistake was about to change everything. Because the truth was this. I had never given Daniel the house. Not legally, not officially, and the documents proving that were sitting in a safety deposit box at the bank. A safety deposit box that only I could access. Vanessa crossed her arms again. This is ridiculous, she said. Leave. But I simply picked up my suitcase. And for the first time that afternoon, I smiled. Not an angry smile. Not a revenge smile. Just a quiet one. Because they had thrown me out of the house. But the house was still mine. And when they discovered that, well, let's just say the next conversation we had didn't happen on the front porch. It happened in front of a lawyer. And what that lawyer said to them, even I didn't expect. Segment 4, almost equals 1,000 words. Turning point, quiet justice, emotional reflection. 3 days after my son threw my suitcase into the trash, I walked into the bank. Not the big modern one downtown. The small brick branch I had been using for almost 30 years. The kind of place where the tellers still recognize your face. The rain had stopped that morning, but the air still smelled damp. Inside, the bank was quiet. Just the soft hum of fluorescent lights and the distant sound of someone counting cash. The clerk behind the counter looked up and smiled. Good morning, Mr. Harper. I nodded politely. I need to access my safety deposit box. She didn't ask questions, just handed me the clipboard. 10 minutes later, I was sitting in a small private room with a metal box in front of me. Inside that box were a few simple things. Margaret's wedding ring, her handwritten letters, and a thin folder. That folder held the one thing Daniel and Vanessa had never bothered to check, the deed to the house. I stared at it for a long moment. 40 years of work, summarized on 2 pieces of paper. Margaret and I had signed those papers the day the house was finished. And even when Daniel moved in, I never transferred ownership. I had thought about it once, years ago, but Margaret had stopped me. Harold, she had said gently, never give away the roof over your head. At the time, I thought she was just being cautious. Now I realized she had been wise. Because if I had signed that house over to Daniel, I would have been standing on that curb with nothing, and my son would have owned everything. But instead, I closed the folder and smiled quietly, because the house still belonged to me. Later that afternoon, I made one more stop, a law office downtown. The name on the door read, Thomas Whitaker, property attorney. Thomas had handled the paperwork when Margaret and I bought the land decades earlier. When I walked into his office, he squinted for a moment. Then recognition spread across his face. Harold Harper? I chuckled. You remember me? Of course I do, he said, shaking my hand. How's Margaret? The question hung in the air. She passed 3 years ago. His smile faded. I'm sorry to hear that. I nodded and placed a folder on his desk. I need some help. 20 minutes later, Thomas leaned back in his chair, adjusting his glasses. Well, he said slowly, this is interesting. Interesting how? I asked. He tapped the deed. The property is still entirely in your name. I know. He smiled slightly. And according to these documents, Daniel Harper has absolutely no legal ownership of the house. I leaned back calmly. That's what I thought. Thomas folded his hands. Why are we discussing this? I told him everything. The locks, the trash bags, the porch. The silence that followed lasted several seconds. Then Thomas sighed. Well, he said, that's illegal. Which part? Changing the locks on the property owner. He shook his head. They can't do that. A strange calm spread through me. What are my options? Thomas smiled. Oh, Harold, you have several. But the option we chose was the one Vanessa never expected. 2 days later, Daniel and Vanessa were sitting in the living room when the doorbell rang. I know this because Daniel told me later exactly what happened. Vanessa opened the door. Standing outside were 2 people, a lawyer and a police officer. Behind them was me. Vanessa frowned. What is this? Thomas Whitaker stepped forward. Good afternoon. I'm representing Mr. Harold Harper. Daniel appeared behind her. His face immediately turned pale. Dad. Thomas held up a document. This is a formal notice regarding unlawful eviction and property access. Vanessa blinked. I'm sorry, what? Thomas spoke calmly. The homeowner standing behind me was locked out of his own property. Daniel looked confused. Wait, homeowner? Thomas nodded. Yes. He turned the document so they could see it. The property at this address is legally owned by Harold Harper. The silence was immediate, heavy. Vanessa stared at the paper. That's impossible. Thomas shook his head. No, it's documented. Daniel looked at me. Dad, is this some kind of joke? I finally spoke. No. His face drained of color. But the house? You live here. I said calmly. You don't own it. Vanessa's voice rose slightly. That's ridiculous. Thomas didn't react. I'm afraid it's quite clear. Then he added something that made Daniel step backward. You also illegally removed the property owner's belongings. Vanessa crossed her arms. This is harassment. The police officer finally spoke. Ma'am, you changed the locks on the homeowner. Her confidence began to crumble. Daniel looked between us. Dad, why didn't you tell us? I looked at him quietly. You never asked. The room fell silent again. Then Thomas spoke one final sentence. Mr. Harper has a legal right to reclaim access to his property immediately. Vanessa stared at me. You're throwing us out? I shook my head slowly. No. And for a moment she looked relieved. Then I added calmly. But things are going to change. I walked into the house, slowly. My house. The smell of the hallway. The creak of the stairs. 40 years of memories. Daniel stood there awkwardly. Dad, we didn't know. I nodded. I believe that. Vanessa looked furious, but she said nothing. Thomas handed me the new key. The locksmith had already restored the original lock. I slipped the key into the door and turned it gently. Then I looked at Daniel. Subscribe to channel.